Today's homily is called So Shall We Rise. This is kind of how I imagined our Easter 2020 service. I had something really elaborate planned because Cynthia had been working since before I arrived, cataloging all the choir music in the church. And she came into my office one day last fall to tell me that she'd found pieces of music that had been added to the church collection way back in 1900. And then 15 minutes later, Lee Kaler walks in and he tells us that he's found service manuals and sermons from the era of Reverend George Thayer, who served this congregation for 30 years, beginning in 1882. He was the one who led the church during its move to Avondale and the construction of the building on Linton that we now consider home. So being the history buff that I am, I thought it would be cool to reenact a service from Thayer's day. The choir would sing old music, Jera would play big old organ pieces, and Meredith would tell the story about old Cincinnati, and I was going to dress in some kind of costume and read one of Thayer's sermons. I wanted to show the evolution of Unitarianism over the decades in the context of Easter. And then, coronavirus. The COVID-19 pandemic has stricken almost 2 million people worldwide and taken the lives of over 100,000. There are more than 500,000 cases just here in the United States. Businesses are closed. Employees have had their hours cut, they've been furloughed or completely laid off. The stock market tanked, leaving retirement accounts decimated. Children haven't been in school for weeks and are learning at home. Sporting events, festivals, and concerts are canceled. Churches and community centers are closed. All 50 states have declared emergencies as we end our 4th week of hunkering down in our homes here in Ohio. And when we do go out, we wear masks and practice physical distancing. Besides making us sick and taking lives, COVID-19 has brought out the worst in some of us. CNN reported that a shopper at an Australian supermarket actually pulled a knife on another shopper in a fight over toilet paper. And then in early March, we were hearing stories almost every day of people hoarding coveted hand sanitizer. There are stories of people deliberately coughing on produce in markets in an effort to I don't know what they're trying to do. And worse yet, as the number of cases increases in this country, so too does the number of cases of racism against Asian Americans. Californian Yan Yang Zhu told the New York Times about an incident that happened to her on March 9th. She was walking to her gym when she noticed that a man was shouting at her. He was yelling an expletive about China. Then a bus passed, and he screamed after it, "Run them over!" She tried to keep her distance, but when the light changed, she found herself stuck waiting with him at the crosswalk. She could feel him staring at her, and then suddenly she felt it. His saliva hitting her face and her favorite sweater. In shock, Ms. Zhu, who is 26 and moved to the United States from China 5 years ago, hurried the rest of the way to the gym. She found a corner where no one else could see her, and she cried quietly. That person didn't look strange or angry or anything, you know. He just looked like a normal person, she said. COVID-19 has exposed some ugly truths about our society. The data shows that while people of color aren't more likely to be infected by coronavirus, we are more likely to be admitted to the ICU or to die of it. Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health cites the prevalence of underlying medical conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and asthma, and says that we really do need to address the health disparities that exist in the United States. It's impacting indigenous populations as well. Maria Givens writes for Vox that the impact of COVID-19 on Indian country looks different from the rest of the U.S. U.S. tribal elders are more at risk of COVID-19 because of high rates of diabetes and heart disease. Clean water for proper hand washing isn't accessible in all tribal communities, and overcrowding in native homes is also common, as many are multi-generational, creating social distancing challenges. Meanwhile, federal funding at the emergency level for tribal health organizations has been delayed within the bureaucracy at Health and Human Services. Then there are the negative economic effects, with hospitality businesses like casinos, often tribes' greatest sources of income, closing. Indian country's resources were stretched thin to begin with, she concludes, and now the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating those disparities. COVID-19 is exposing the depth of poverty and economic insecurity in the country overall as well. 69% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. Bankrate says that 30% of the population owes more on their credit cards than they have in their savings account. And a survey by Willis Towers Watson found that almost 20% of people making more than $100,000 a year still live paycheck to paycheck. The facade of middle-class economic stability is cracking. And as hard as it is for them, it's even harder for the people who are underemployed, trying to get by on low-paying jobs, struggling to pay for food, rent, and utilities, the basics. The grocery store cashiers, the custodians, the maintenance workers, the people that we now refer to as heroes, the people we thank for staying at their posts and serving us. For many of these folks, they don't have a choice. Many don't have savings. They don't work, they don't eat. And in perhaps the cruelest twist of all, what does a stay-at-home order mean to a person who is experiencing homelessness? What happens when you don't have a home to stay in? It's a tough time. We're unsure what comes next. We don't know when we'll get back to normal, or even what normal will be. To quote Eric Pevernaghi, we feel the world is slipping out of our hands and recognize that the core of our conceived blueprint is escaping us. And here we are, at the intersection of two major but very different religious holidays. It is Passover, the celebration of the end of slavery and hardship for the Jews in Egypt, the celebration of their covenant with God. During Passover, Moses warned the Egyptian Pharaoh that God would bring 10 plagues upon the oppressors of the Jews. The last of these was the death of every firstborn son of Egypt. The houses of the faithful Jews were passed over and their children saved. And in this most holy time, I've heard more than one rabbi question whether COVID-19 is the 11th plague. And it is Easter, the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. This celebration in Christianity establishes Jesus as the Son of God and assures believers that those with faith will receive eternal salvation. As it says in John chapter 5, verses 28 through 29, do not be astonished at this. For the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. For our Jewish and Christian friends, their faith will carry them through these hard times. But what about the rest of us? What about Unitarian Universalists? Most UUs don't believe in religious miracles of the Bible, don't believe that the plagues happened or that Jesus was resurrected. Many UUs don't want to have anything to do with miracle stories and shut down in disgust at the mere mention of the R word. And by that, I mean resurrection. But I will say to you this morning that there is meaning in both these traditions for us too, if we can open our hearts and minds to receive it. Resurrection comes from the Latin word meaning to rise again. We shall be resurrected from COVID-19 just as the dormant earth returns to light in the spring. 19th century Christian socialist and reformer Charles Kingsley wrote, "See the land her Easter keeping rises as her maker rose. Seed so long in darkness sleeping burst at least from winter snows." Despite all that is happening and with no intervention on our part, spring is here. The flowers and the trees don't know anything about COVID-19 or coronavirus or stay-at-home orders. Nature is doing what it does, rising again because it's spring. It's the cycle of life. We shall rise again, just like the earth. There are some other R words that come to mind on this day. One is reminder. As I think of the physical, emotional, and economic devastation this virus is causing all over the globe, I'm reminded of the old adage attributed to both Persian Sufi poets and to Jewish folklore that this too shall pass. This situation, our entire lives, are but a blip in the big picture of time. It will end. We'll develop a vaccine, or we'll develop immunity, or the coronavirus will disappear as quickly as it came. Somehow, some way, someday, this pandemic will end. Just as COVID-19 has brought out the worst in us, it has also brought out the best in us. We are renewing our relationships and reestablishing connection with one another and with the earth. Even though we can't physically visit with our friends and our neighbors, we make phone calls and video chat and text. We're finding time to reconnect with ourselves, with those friends, and with our neighbors. We're seeing less focus on individualism and more on our duty and responsibility to one another. Healthcare workers and first responders provide examples of that every day. Police officers, firefighters, paramedics, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare workers are on the front lines of helping the sick while exposing themselves to this disease in the process. Many essential workers such as garbage collectors, grocery store clerks, and delivery people share that sense of responsibility, though some, as I said earlier, are working because they have no choice. All of us, in practicing physical distancing and staying at home, are doing our part for our larger community, and our efforts are paying off. As Dr. Amy Acton tells us every day, you did this, Ohio. Together, we're flattening the curve and stopping the spread of the coronavirus because we finally figured out that we really are all in this together. And we are resilient. We've returned before from situations and conditions that seemed insurmountable. The 1918 flu pandemic, the Great Depression, World War II, 9/11, and acts of global terrorism. We've come back before and we will come back again. We are resilient and we are creative. We are figuring out new ways of doing things. TV news and talk show programs come to us live from the presenters' homes instead of their studios. Did you ever imagine that our choir would be able to sing together while being confined to their own individual homes? I used Zoom on a weekly basis for 3 years during seminary, but never imagined that I would be leading worship this way. I know there are some things that technology can't replace, and that families are required to forego memorial and funeral services, and that weddings and other mass celebrations have been canceled. Still, we're finding ways to connect with one another, to celebrate and to share with one another. For example, the couple who stood in the middle of the street and had their officiant conduct their wedding ceremony from an apartment balcony. The young woman who pressed her hand against her grandfather's nursing home window to show him her new engagement ring. The drive-by birthday parades. We are resilient and we are creative. Encouraged by these reminders, guided by our resilience and responsibility and our relationships, so shall we rise. Businesses will reopen, kids will go back to school, and our church will open its doors once again. The quarantine will be lifted and we'll stop wearing masks. So shall we rise, but not back to where we were. As a society, we have been changed by this. We can't go back to what we were. We will be different. Hopefully, we will be better. Hopefully, we will be kinder to ourselves and to others. So shall we rise to do the work of justice, to correct the inequities and the problems of our society, to eliminate poverty, income inequality, racism, and homelessness, not just to talk about it, but to do the real work of dismantling the systemic injustices that have been so deeply rooted in our society for too many years. So shall we rise, determined not to let this be a temporary period of love and cooperation, but rather a permanent way of being with one another. As Scotty McLennan writes, we need to be open to resurrection, to looking up, not down, to listening, not stopping up our ears, tasting before we swallow, to smelling the flowers, not passing them by, to feeling deeply rather than numbing ourselves with the daily routine. So shall we rise with renewed hope, courage, and faith in ourselves and in each other. May it be so.